So, a couple things before we get going. Let's scroll down here. Excuse me. Actually, I'll get this going so we can take a look at that later. So I've got that Module 10 quiz. I'll be releasing that as soon as we're done today with class. That Module 11 reading is due before we start class tomorrow. I've got all the Module 11 kind of files up there. I had to play around with, there was some sync issue with Canvas and Top Hat, so I had to delete this assignment and like resync it. It should only be showing up once now. I think it was showing up like twice in the grade book, so I believe that should be corrected now. All those scores, once the due date passes, will get kind of synced up over to Canvas, so it might be showing blank on Canvas right now. But whatever score you get in Top Hat, that'll be synced up after class tomorrow once that due date has passed. Right? Other than that, yesterday's class participation quiz, I put up an announcement about it. It was the one where that third one kind of had a little bit of a bug in it. I should have looked at the numbers a little more carefully. I gave you what what was being accepted as the correct answer. Once that due date passes next Sunday, I'll go in and make sure that everyone is just given credit no matter what they put for that third question. But I can't do that until after the due date passes. So if you didn't see the recording or, as we were talking about it, you put in the wrong value, that'll get adjusted once that due date passes as well. Okay. Other than that, don't think there's anything else I have to kind of mention logistically. So unless there's any other questions not related to kind of content here, we'll kind of dive into it. Okay. So we were looking at kind of the shutdown decision that firms have in the short run. So we said, anytime price is above our average total cost, and we had kind of our profit equations that helped us see this, that meant firms were going to be earning a positive economic profit. If the price ever falls below average total, we now know that profits will be negative, right? So the idea there is our per unit costs are higher than our per unit profits. That's what the price is for these perfectly competitive firms. However, once profits are negative, we have two ranges. If that price is still above average variable cost, then by staying open, those additional variable costs are less than the additional money I'm making per unit. So we'd actually be minimizing our losses. So we'll still have negative profits, but they'll be closer to zero, right, than if we shut down. Now, if the price ever falls below average variable, essentially what's that saying? The additional per unit revenue is less than the additional cost created by staying open. So in this scenario, we would say the firm was better off just shutting down. Their profits there would just be then their negative fixed costs. Okay. So really the long run supply curve, if we think about what that's going to look like, if we had our average variable costs, we know that in the short run, right, firms are only going to produce as long as the price is somewhere above that minimum point of the average variable cost curve. Right? So I'll kind of give a little bit more insight into this. So if we're thinking about why that is the short run supply curve, and it looks a little bit different, it's because whatever our average variable costs are, right, we know that in terms of the price, and really not just putting price, we're putting like costs here. So this is really just dollars on our y-axis. If we're thinking about, so let's say here we have our entire marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost at its minimum point. How do firms choose the optimal quantity? Well, we said it's wherever that price, which is their marginal revenue, hits the marginal cost curve. So like in this example, okay, at that quantity, our price is above average variable cost, so we would stay open. The price was here. Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That price is above average variable, we'd stay open. However, if we ever get prices that fall below that minimum point of our average variable cost, we're now going to be choosing an optimal quantity that maximizes profits at a point where the price is below average variable. So any price kind of in this range, we said we're going to shut down. What does shut down mean? Well, I'm not choosing to produce anything here. I would just be producing nothing, right? which is why when we're looking at that short run kind of cost curve, it's really that any price below that minimum point of the average variable cost, we're going to see the firm produces nothing. As soon as the price gets to be above that average variable cost, now we'll see they start to select quantities where they're going to be maximizing economic profits by staying open. Okay. So our short run supply curve technically doesn't like go all the way down like our usual marginal cost curve does. At that minimum point of the average variable cost, it just becomes zero. All right. So with this idea in mind, each firm, right, with these perfectly competitive markets, we said there's many firms, many buyers, but there's also many sellers. So each firm is going to choose a quantity, right, based off of their short run supply curve. We would then add those all up to get our industry or our market supply curve, right? So short run kind of industry supply curves will be adding up the quantity supplied at every single price, right? So our short run market equilibrium will be where that market quantity supplied is equal to the market quantity demanded. So where supply is equal to demand, and that's going to tell us the number of, the total quantity in the market given the number of producers we currently have. So when we're thinking about the industry or the market supply curve, it's identifying where that equilibrium quantity is going to be and what the quantity per firm would be, but holding constant the number of firms. Okay. So in the long run, right, we're going to see that, okay, yes, we still have that the quantity supplied will equal to quantity demanded, or supply is equal to demand. However, in the short run, we said we can have negative or positive profits. Okay. So even though we can identify these profit maximizing quantities for the firms, that kind of quantity each firm is producing will change if firms enter or exit, because there's still the same overall demand. It's just now that we have a kind of sales, if you want to think about it that way, spread out over more firms. Okay. So in the long run, right, we're going to end up with a supply curve that looks pretty similar to the one that we talked about before, because as firms enter and exit, right, that's going to change the kind of per unit or the number of units each firm is producing. So we'll kind of take a look at, all right, we've got this short run supply curve, but how is the long run supply curve going to be determined? Well, firms are going to be able to enter and exit in the long run, right? So what's that going to look like? Okay. So we'll start out with a scenario where let's assume we've got a short run supply, short run kind of demand curve, such that the current equilibrium price of the good is above the average total cost. We said last class, because we have, do I have it on here? No. So I'll write it out for us just to be kind of a reminder. What are profits? We said we could rewrite profits as the quantity that the firm is producing times the difference between whatever that equilibrium price is and the average total cost of the firm. Now, we talked last class about, okay, if supply and demand shift, that would shift my equilibrium price and potentially cause my profits to change, right? But as long as that equilibrium price is above our average total cost, we should have positive profits, okay? If we have positive profits, right, what do we know? What are firms going to do? Well, currently, firms are choosing their optimal profit maximizing quantity. So the current firms we have, there's no incentive for them to produce more or less. They are maximizing profits, right? Other firms look at this and say, or potential firms look at this and say, well, there's positive profits being made in this industry. I kind of want a piece of that pie, right? I want to get into that market. So maybe they start selling that product, right? So, if you go back far enough, like when energy drinks were introduced, there was only a couple companies doing it. Now you've got, every major, Coke, Pepsi, they might kind of hide behind the different brand names, but they all have their own kind of line of energy. And we've seen a lot pop up, right? People enter that market, okay? So if firms see these positive profits, they're going to enter. Well, what's that going to do to market supply? Well, the individual firm supply curve is still whatever it was before, but when additional firms enter a market, what happens to our supply curve going back to like module 3? Oh, it increases supply, right? So anytime we see an increase in supply, what does that do to our equilibrium price? It's going to decrease it, push it down. And I'll have a visual of this here in a second, but this is all things that we talked about back in module 3. So as that equilibrium price is going down, what's happening to the profits of the firm? It's more likely these are getting closer and closer together until eventually, if price decreases enough to where it's equal to average total cost, what would profits now be? Zero. Now, is there any incentive for a firm to enter this industry? No, right? They'd be indifferent about joining it or not. So anytime we have positive profits, firms will enter, increase market supply, which decreases the price until that price falls low enough such that profits are equal to zero, right? Or the point where price is equal to marginal cost. So firms are still using that optimal production rule where price, the equilibrium price or marginal revenue for the firm is equal to marginal cost. It's just that firms will enter until these profits get driven down to zero. Okay. Now, what if we had the flip side being true? Well, if price is below average total cost, we said from that same equation, we could see that profits are negative. If profits are negative, what are some firms in the long run going to decide to do? Well, I can't hemorrhage money from forever, right? Maybe I'm maximizing profits by not shutting down in the short run, right? By staying open, but I can't do that forever, right? So eventually, when we have negative profits, more and more firms will choose to leave that market, right? So when there's negative profits, firms exit. If we have fewer firms, what happens to our supply curve? It decreases. If we drew back in module 3 a decrease in supply, what does that do to our equilibrium price? It's going to increase it. As the price gets higher and higher, it's more likely, right? That gap in between price and average total cost is getting smaller and smaller until enough firms exit such that that optimal quantity where price is equal to marginal cost is at a point where profits are now equal to zero. Now there's no incentive for any firm to continue, to exit this market, right? They don't have negative profits. Okay. Excuse me. So I've got some visuals in the slide, and I'll draw out a few to kind of, I don't know, just see different ways of thinking about this. But let's say I started out, here's my market supply and demand curve. Here's that current equilibrium price, okay? So from last class, we said, okay, what's the optimal quantity for the firm where that price or their marginal revenue is equal to their marginal cost? Right? That's at this quantity out here. At that quantity, what's true about my price relative to average total cost? Well, price is above my average total cost. So we said, what would this rectangle represent? Well, the height is the difference between price and average total cost. The width is just the quantity I'm producing. What does that look like? My profit equation. Difference between price and average total cost times the number of units the firm is producing. That rectangle represents my profits, right? In this case, because price is above average total, we know profits are positive, okay? Now, other firms see this and say, well, we want to get involved in this market. So firms start to enter this market. What does that do to our new equilibrium price? Well, it's going to push our equilibrium quantity up. And I'll come back to this in a second. And it's going to lower that equilibrium price. So this is where we get somewhat of a counterintuitive result. But as firms enter, there's more competition. We can think about it that way. The price is going down. At this new price, where does it hit my marginal cost, or where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? Right at this point, at a lower quantity. Price here is exactly equal to average total cost. So what would my profits now be? Oh, scrolled too far. Profits would be equal to zero. Okay. So when we have positive profits, firms enter until we get to this minimum point of our average total cost curve, right? In which case we know the profits are going to be equal to zero. There's now no longer an incentive for firms to enter, and this is where it would stop. Okay. So the counterintuitive result here is, well, sorry, I'll start with the intuitive result. As the price goes down, what happens to the quantity that each firm is choosing? Well, there's going to be some units in this range where before that revenue I could make from those units was above the additional costs. However, at this lower price, for every unit in this range, the additional costs are now greater than the additional revenue. So it wouldn't make sense if I'm wanting to maximize profits to any longer produce those units. So the intuitive result is that when firms enter a market and they push the price down, we see each firm, relative to what they were producing before, produces a lower quantity. However, what happened to the quantity in the market? It actually went up. So what must be true? Well, if each firm is producing less, but I now have more firms, that firm entrance effect is going to be larger than that reduction in quantity that each firm is seeing. So you could think of this as like, maybe before I had 2 firms producing 100 units. So there was a total of 200 in the market. Now I've got 3 firms, each producing 75, so a little bit less, but I've got 3 firms. So 3 firms times 75 would be 225, right? So I saw the market quantity went up, even though the quantity each firm produces goes down. So we start making a differentiation now between the quantity that the firm produces and the total quantity in the market. And notationally, I typically kind of do this lower and uppercase. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? I spent time with all these animations, so I'll draw it out by hand as well. But I think this is hopefully a really good depiction of it once you see it kind of step by step, what's happening. So let's start out assuming instead that we've got the market equilibrium price is quite a bit lower, such that where marginal revenue, where that price hits my marginal cost curve, that profit maximizing quantity is down here. Now we'll assume here, just for the sake of this example, I don't have my average variable cost in here just to not muddy up the graph, but we're going to assume that it's above their average variable cost so that they should stay open in the short run. If they stay open in the short run, what would their profits be? Well, once again, it's just the quantity they produce. So that would be the width of this rectangle times the difference between price and average total cost. But now price is below average total cost. So this rectangle will represent my profits, but whatever value that is, it's going to be negative, right? It's going to represent a loss. Okay. So if I have negative profits, what are firms going to do? Well, maybe in the short run, they'll stay open, but over time, some of those firms are going to exit that industry. Okay? I can't hemorrhage money forever. And so firms start to exit, right? As time passes. What does that do to our equilibrium price and quantity? Well, that's actually going to increase our equilibrium price, decrease the quantity we see in the market. Okay. At this higher price, what's my new optimal profit maximizing quantity? Well, where does this new price or marginal revenue hit marginal cost? Firms will exit until it hits this point where I'm at the minimum of my average total cost curve, which at this quantity, my profit should be 0. Okay. Price is equal to average total cost here. So no matter what we start out with in the short run, firms will enter and exit until we get to this long run outcome, which is that profits, economic profits, are exactly equal to 0. We end up at this minimum point of our average total cost curve. Okay. Now, once again, we get kind of this weird result, which is as firms exit, the quantity in the market goes down. However, the quantity each firm is producing can go up, right? So the reason why, once again, before every unit in this range for the firm, the additional costs were above the additional revenue, so they didn't produce these units. As firms exit and the price they can charge is higher, well, now for every unit in this range, the additional costs are below the additional revenues, so now it makes sense to produce these. Okay. So it doesn't matter where we start out. If we have positive or negative profits, firms will enter and exit to give us long run profits of 0. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So just to kind of give you a depiction of the long run, right? In the long run, we know that we're going to end up with an equilibrium price that is at the very kind of minimum point of the average total cost curve of each firm. So like in the long run, everything's equal, right? So the price is equal to the, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost is equal to the minimum point of the average total cost curve. In fact, what will end up being true is there's actually a bunch of short run cost curves, right? And they make up my long run average total cost curve, right? So in the short run, here's my kind of per unit cost. Well, what can I do over time? I can change my factors of production. Skip ahead here. There we go. I can change my factors of production so that I can lower my per unit cost. So in the short run, I'm like, this was like if we go back, I introduced this idea back in module 9. Remember when we said we could choose different size production facilities? Well, in the long run, I can move to different size production facilities. We said like the minimum point of every short run cost curve, if we mapped or kind of trace those out, those minimum points would give us the long run average total cost curve. Excuse me. So we had economies of scale. If by producing more, changing these long run factors of production, we were actually lowering our per unit cost or getting to a lower short run average total cost curve. And then kind of on the flip side, if increasing our quantity, we were actually increasing those short run average total cost curves, we said we had diseconomies of scale. So that's kind of where that long run average total cost curve came from. In the long run, we end up on that lowest possible short run average total cost curve as well. Right? We change all the factors of production that we can in the long run to get those per unit costs to be as low as possible. Okay. All right. How much time do we have? Okay. I think this hopefully will kind of suffice with firm entry and exit. I'll add in some things here. We'll go through some additional drawings in a second, but I want to introduce this idea of what's happening when we see a demand increase. So I'll show you this and then I'll go draw one out for you. So let's say you kind of thought about, all right, well, let's assume that we're starting out at a point where profits are equal to zero. So we kind of think about we're in the long run, right? So if I'm at a price that's exactly hitting marginal cost at the minimum point of my average total cost curve, right, that's going to be the quantity that each firm is producing, right? I would then take that, multiply it by the number of firms. That would give me the total market quantity. Well, initially, right, if I'm thinking about the market, right? So I took this quantity, multiplied by the number of firms. Maybe this would be the total quantity in the market. Okay. However, if all of a sudden demand for that product increases, right? What did we say? There we go. Demand for the product increases, it's going to increase the equilibrium price. What is that going to do to the firm's decision? Well, they're now going to choose a quantity that's higher, right? That new higher equilibrium price hits my marginal cost curve at a higher quantity. Okay. Well, what's now true? So each firm, we haven't had any firms enter or exit yet. So just that demand increase that pushed the price up, I'm going to see that each firm is producing a higher number of units. So the market quantity is going to go up. However, I now have what? Positive profits because price is above my average total cost. Okay. So what's going to happen? Firms will start to enter that market. Well, what's going to happen as firms enter that market? It's going to increase the supply curve, which pushes the price back down so that we would have what? The number of units each firm is producing may stay kind of the same, but I have more firms. So I'm now going to see, okay, the equilibrium price gets driven back down to that minimum point of the average total cost curve. But because of that demand increase, we see an increase in the quantity in the market. Okay. So I'll walk through this slightly differently here to kind of give an idea about what these demand changes look like. And I'll actually do I'll do a demand decrease just so we kind of have a different visual than what's in the slides. So let's say I've got kind of my market quantity. I've got the quantity of each firm, right? And I want, here's my supply, here's my demand, here's the initial equilibrium price. That's going to be the firm's demand curve or their marginal revenue. Okay. So let's start out assuming I've got my marginal cost of the firm and I've got my average total costs. So currently, what would the firm's profits be? Well, marginal cost hits marginal revenue at a quantity where price is equal to average total cost. So profits start out as zero. Okay. Now, as firms, let's say we don't have firms enter exit because we've got zero profits. Let's say we had a decrease in demand for this product. Okay. So a decrease in demand would be a leftward shift. What does that do to our equilibrium price? It decreases it. What would have to be true? Okay, at this lower price, this is the new firm's marginal revenue or the new firm's demand curve. They're now going to be choosing the profit maximizing quantity But notice when there's a demand decrease, what's going to happen? Well, now price is below my average total cost, so profits are negative after that demand decrease. Okay. So initially, we kind of started out. Here was the market quantity. Each firm is now producing less. We haven't had firms enter or exit yet. We haven't allowed that time to pass. We just said, what is the initial impact of a demand decrease? Okay. So I'll kind of keep this running total. So the demand decrease did what? It lowered kind of the quantity of the firm and ultimately lowered the quantity on the market. Okay. However, if we're thinking about the long run impacts of that demand decrease, so let's say whatever that demand decrease was, it was persistent across time. Well, now that profits are negative, what's going to happen? Well, now some firms are going to want to exit this market. So as firms exit this market, what's going to happen to our market supply curve? Right? It's going to decrease. Right? So what's going to happen is we're going to see I guess this was putting 3 here to kind of sequentially say, this demand shift happened first. Now we see that firms exit, so we get this supply decrease. Well, what's that going to do? Well, where's my new demand hit my new supply curve? Pushes the price back up to whatever it was before. Hope we can kind of see the blue here. So now my marginal revenue curve, that price is higher, goes back up to where firms are going to be choosing choosing a quantity that results in zero economic profits. So in the short run, these demand decreases could cause profits for the firms that remain to be negative. However, if firms can respond in the long run, whenever we see this demand increase, firms will join, right? Sorry, not join. We're doing a demand decrease. When we have negative profits, firms will exit until we get that price to be back to whatever it was before, where we're earning zero profits. But notice what has happened to the quantity in the market. Well, now when we have this supply decrease, that will kind of push the price back up. It's going to push the quantity of each firm back up, right? So the quantity of the firm goes back to whatever it was before, but we have fewer firms. So where is the new equilibrium quantity? The market quantity will actually go down. And that's kind of intuitive, right? If the demand for a product decreases, even once firms can enter and exit and change their production decision, ultimately that's going to result in a lower quantity in that market. Right? So just a different way of kind of thinking about this with some colors, and I've tried to use numbers, even if it's not, the most vibrant, where you can kind of think about the initial change going from 1 to 2 was this demand decrease. As a response to that demand decrease and the lower price, firms exit. That pushes the supply curve kind of back or decreases our supply curve, getting us back to the point where now profits are zero. So we're back to the long run where profits are zero, but the result of that demand decrease is going to be that the quantity in the market goes down. Okay? So in the long run, no change to the firm's quantity, but there will be a change to the market quantity of that demand decrease. And that's kind of what we have going on here with the demand increase, right? It's going to push them back down to that same quantity that firms were at before. However, now we're going to see the quantity in the market actually goes up. So just the reverse of what I just drew for us. Excuse me. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So what'll be true, and this isn't probably not really going to ask you a lot of questions on this, but just to be kind of complete in our discussion of this, what'll end up being true is that short run supply curve is always going to be steeper than our long run supply curve. So if we kind of think about why, in the long run, we can change more things. We have more time to respond. So what can we be? We can be more elastic. Now, we've said back in module 4, elasticity and slope aren't exactly the same thing, but they are related, right? Because, we had a perfectly elastic curve that was going to be horizontal. Perfectly inelastic was completely vertical. So it's not one-to-one, but they are related. So the flatter long run supply curve represents that those producers can be a little bit more elastic. Okay. So this is because in the long run, firms aren't, just kind of locked in to whatever their fixed factors of production are, but also in the long run, firms can start to enter or exit, right? And those will have kind of larger influences on the price and quantity in the market. Okay. So we already I skipped ahead and kind of talked about this to kind of give you an idea of what that long run average total cost curve was looking like. Now I got one where I think this is a little bit tricky. I've got it in here. I want to do one first. Before we look at that, I think I can introduce this idea to be a little bit. I think then when we go to the graph and the slides, it'll make it easier. So let's say we just talked about how would demand changes impact the firm's production decisions, profits, and then whether or not firms enter or exit. Let's think about instead, well, we'll do it this way. Let's say I stack these graphs again. And I think about, well, I don't know. We got to walk before we can run. I don't want to throw too much at you at once. Sorry, I'm going back and forth about. So here we go. So here we'll think about just the firm. Okay. So let's say we've got the firm and here's their marginal costs to production. Let's think about, I've got my average total costs, right? And we'll start out in the long run. Okay. So whatever that initial price was, the quantity, the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, the quantity that maximizes profits for the firm would be right here. So we've got profits start out, price is equal to average total cost is 0. Okay. What if this firm, let's assume that they can't change anything about their marginal cost or like the production cost that they currently have, but somehow they're able to eliminate some of their fixed costs. Okay. So if their marginal cost curve stays the same, but they eliminate some of their fixed costs, right? Maybe this is something they're locked in. You can almost think about, okay, well, my new average total cost at every point is going to be lower, right? So you could think about if I was just eliminating fixed costs, I'm going to have whatever my variable costs and my marginal costs were before, but my average total will be a little bit lower because my average total was average variable plus average fixed. So I try to draw this to scale. So this is going to be like the new kind of point where the minimum point of my new average total cost curve. Well, notice at this price, if I've only influenced fixed costs, haven't changed my marginal cost at all, what's going to happen to the quantity that the firm produces? Well, I didn't change my marginal costs. Marginal revenue is still whatever that old equilibrium, right? Just because I cut my cost, that didn't change any, or sorry, I've eliminated fixed costs. It didn't change the equilibrium price in the market. I would actually be the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue is actually at the exact same quantity. However, what is now true about my price, or sorry, we're using the same price, relative to my average total cost, well, now at that quantity, my price is now above average total cost. So now my profits are actually positive. And we could compute them by simply thinking about, okay, difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm producing. This would represent now positive profits. And that's kind of intuitive. If I can eliminate some of my costs, right, some of these fixed costs, these things I was locked into, maybe this is like initially, I had some huge loans that I was paying off, or I took out some loans to start the business. Once I've paid them off, I've eliminated that fixed cost. It's no longer, it never really played into my production cost in terms of the actual physical making of the goods. So I haven't changed my marginal cost. I just eliminated fixed costs. I now can I'm at a point where now profits are positive. So what would firms do in response to this? Well, once there's positive profits, firms would enter that market. As they enter, it decreases the price, right? So as firms enter this market and that price starts to go lower and lower, eventually we would get back to a new price where firm's going to choose a lower quantity and now profits are back to zero. So, that's in the long run though. So if I'm thinking about like the total profits of the firm over the entire time span, well, if I can lower my fixed cost, maybe like in the short run, I can experience some of these positive profits. And yes, if we have firm entry and exit, they'll get driven back down to zero. But I made some money before that happened. And then being very non-technical the way I'm talking about this, but yeah. Okay. Is that any questions on the idea of lowering my average total cost there? Okay. Now, what might be a little bit trickier is let's assume that I not only changed my, and this is not labeled correctly. I was probably copying and pasting and forgot to change it. There we go. So I'll update the slides after class. I updated them yesterday for the one typo I had. So let's say I'm able to change not just the fixed factor, I can change other factors. So kind of similar to this, it's not just like I'm eliminating a fixed cost. Maybe I'm choosing to move to like different size production facilities. So I'm able to kind of get to a lower average total cost, but at the same time, it's part of my production process. So I'm not just lowering my average total, I'm also lowering my marginal cost. Okay? So let's say we kind of started out with zero profits. Well, if I'm able to lower my total cost, I've got economies of scale here. Well, the price is still 4. Where would the price now, or that marginal revenue now hit my marginal cost? It's going to be at a quantity out here. So the firm will choose to produce a higher quantity than they were before. Once again, kind of an intuitive result. If I can lower my costs, there's going to be some units that weren't profitable before, right? Every unit in this range, the additional revenue was less than the additional cost. Now every unit in this range, the additional revenue is greater than the additional costs. So we're going to see, oh, scrolled too far. The quantity that they choose goes up. And now what's true? Well, at this quantity, the price is now above my new average total cost curve, and I actually have positive economic profits. Okay. So whether or not we just eliminate a fixed cost, or we can actually change these other factors of production that allow us to get to a lower average total and lower marginal cost as well, both of them result in us choosing kind of these higher this one resulted in us choosing a higher quantity. If it was just the fixed factor of production, we said it didn't influence the quantity that I was choosing, but both of them created positive economic profits. Now, in the long run, if I've found a way, right, I've enjoyed these economies of scale, I've changed something that lower my cost, what is everyone else going to do? They're going to mimic that. So they say, okay, if there's positive profits to be made here, we can mimic whatever this current firm is doing with their costs. Excuse me. Firms will enter this market, right? As firms enter this market, what happens to supply increases. We said that lowers the price until this gets driven back down to kind of profits being equal to zero. Okay. So some conclusions that we kind of have here, and I think I'll draw out one more thing related to this idea of changing costs. So if we're thinking about a perfectly competitive market, right, what we're essentially assuming in all of these models, and we haven't talked about, we're assuming that every firm is able to change these fixed factors, is able to change their cost curve. So no firm has any difference in cost. Every time we look at the firms, like a depiction of the firm, we essentially call them like representative firms. Every firm faces the exact same costs, right? And so as a result, we're going to see each firm choose the same kind of optimal profit maximizing quantity. However, in the short run, we said we could have positive or negative profits, but if we allow firms to enter or exit, even when things like demand change or things like the cost of the firm change, new firms will enter or exit the market to push us back down to that long run economic profits of zero. And then we kind of think about, there's no, in the long run, equilibrium, a perfectly competitive market, that there's no transaction, right, where it's only going to benefit one side, right? Where we're going to see anytime there are positive profits, there will be a response by firms to enter that market. It can't be mutually beneficial, right? Firms are entering that market, that's good for them. But we said what happens is firms enter a market, pushes the price down, it's bad for existing firms. So there's no kind of mutually beneficial outcome in terms of firm behavior moving towards that long run through firm entry and exit. So I said we'd have quite a bit of time to go through things today. So before we go to, before we go to the quiz or the participation questions, let me think what I want to do here. Let's do, well, we'll do those first, and then we'll see how much time we have. Start picking and choosing some problems. So we're down here, 722. All right. Sorry. Go to preview. Okay. So here I've got just two questions we'll be thinking about. So let's assume that we currently have 10 firms earning zero economic profits. If the product they sell is experiencing an increase in demand, then short-run profits of the firm will do what, and the quantity each firm produces will do what. So here we're thinking about, and we had this in the slide, so this is a reason I did this, so I can also draw one out for you. Okay. So let's say we've got my market, I've got my firm, so this is kind of like our market here, and we've got our supply, we've got our demand curve, we got our equilibrium price. We said that equilibrium price will be the firm's demand curve or the firm's marginal revenue curve. Right? If we're starting out in a scenario, right? And let me make sure I have what it said correct. So 10 firms earning zero profits. Yep. So zero profits, what do we know is going to be true? Well, that quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, if profits are equal to zero, it must be that we're at the minimum point of our average total cost curve. Okay. So what's going to happen if we see a demand increase in this market? Okay. Well, if I see a demand increase, once again, this isn't a cumulative exam, but the class is comprehensive, we would have to know a demand increase looks like a rightward shift in demand. So rightward shift in demand, we've got this new higher equilibrium price. At this higher equilibrium price, what must be true? And so we've got a new higher marginal revenue curve. Because marginal costs are increasing here, we know we're always going to be looking at that portion of the marginal cost where we have diminishing returns. Well, anytime that price goes up, it's going to have to hit marginal cost at a higher quantity. But if we started out with zero profits at that minimum point of the average total cost curve, as we look at higher and higher quantities, if that price is going higher, what's happening to the gap in between price and average total cost? It's getting larger and larger. Sorry, I should have done it this way. It's getting larger and larger, right? So now I'm thinking about that price is above my average total cost, so I've now got profits that are positive. Okay. So there we go. So we said that in the short run, they will have profits that are increasing, right? They start out at zero and now they're positive. Excuse me. They must have increased, right? Sorry. Kid. All right. So we have an increase in profits. And what's happening to the quantity each firm is producing? Well, in the short run, we said the quantity each firm produces will also increase, right? So we've got profits increase, and also the quantity each firm produces is going to be increasing as well, okay? Any questions on that before I kind of add something in here? Okay. All right. So that's the question. I'm going to add to it now, right? So we have positive profits now. And if we wanted to, can we identify what those profits are? Well, yeah, here's my new average total cost. Here was the new price. So my profits would be represented by this rectangle. Why? Because my profits should be equal to the quantity I'm now selling times the difference between price and average total cost. Okay, so if I had numbers on this, grid lines, I could actually calculate what profits are. So once profits are positive, what's going to happen? Well, firms are going to see this. They're going to want to enter that market. We said firms will start to enter that market until we get this new supply curve, right? Such that the point where the new demand and supply curve intersect is back to that same price as it was before. So now my marginal revenue after firms enter this market, right? That marginal revenue price goes back down. I now get back to that minimum point of the average total cost curve, and profits are now to zero. Now, one caveat here is because of this demand increase, then the resulting response by firms, what happened to the market quantity? Well, even though the quantity each firm produces, I guess I could put a 3 here, right? Goes back to being the same as it was before, in the long run, the effect of that demand increase, because then firms entered, we end up with the quantity in the market actually goes up. So each firm is producing the same quantity because their costs haven't changed. We get back down to that minimum point of the average total cost curve where profits are zero, but we have more firms. So if I take the number each firm is producing, it's now multiplied by a higher number of firms, I'll end up with a higher market quantity. We can almost think about when I'm writing out like capital Q here. So the quantity on the market, it's like the quantity of each firm times the number of firms. So even though the quantity of each firm went back to whatever it was before, the number of firms here we said went up when they entered the market. Okay. All right. So I know this stuff starts to get a little bit trickier. So I'm acknowledging that here. We'll kind of spend, like I said, have some time to work through more problems here today. So we've got, assume that we've now got a perfectly competitive market, and currently firms are able to find a way to lower their marginal cost, which inherently is going to then lower their average total cost. So in the short run, what's going to happen to the quantity each firm produces, and in the long run, profits will be what? Well, first of all, in the long run, this should always be an easy question. In the long run, what is going to be true about profits? They are always equal to zero. Now, intuitively, if I can lower my marginal costs, initially in that short run, am I going to want to produce more or less than I was before? Well, that equilibrium price hasn't changed. So intuitively, if I've lowered my per unit and my marginal cost, my average total marginal cost, I should want to increase how much I'm producing, right? Now we can see this visually, right? Because we said if I've got initially something that looks like this, right? And let's say I'll do an extreme one actually to make a point here. So let's say this is the current price of the good, and I've got my marginal cost curve here, and I've got my average total cost curve. So I started out here with a scenario where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs down here at this lower quantity. So here, I shouldn't have wrote capital Q here because we're looking at the firm. So we're thinking about kind of the quantity each firm produces. Okay. What's true at that quantity? Well, the average total cost is actually greater than that price. So I know that profits are actually going to be negative. So here are kind of my negative profits that exist. Okay. So I could start out with a scenario where I've got negative profits, but if I'm able to identify something in my production process where I can lower my costs, so I'm going to try to draw this to kind of scale here. So I've lowered my average total and my marginal costs. Well, facing these new cost curves, the price hasn't changed. There's been no kind of movement in the demand. There's been no entry or exit of firms. I've just lowered my costs, right? What's going to end up happening in the short run? Well, the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost is now going to be at a higher quantity. So the intuitive result there, if I can lower my costs, every unit in this range before the additional revenue was less than the additional costs. Now every unit in this range, the additional revenue is still the same, but I've lowered the costs. Now it makes sense to produce these units. So we're going to see the quantity each firm produces increases. And by finding these ways to cut my costs, what have I done? Price is now above my average total cost. Sorry, our price didn't change. So this is still P1. Average total cost is what we've seen change. So how can I calculate profits? Well, that's just going to be the difference between price and average total cost times the number of units they're selling. But now this rectangle doesn't represent negative profits. Now I would have profits that are positive, right? So even if there was no firm entry or exit, there's no shifts in demand. If firms are able to find ways to change their cost structure or change, enjoy these economies of scale, moving down that long run average total cost curve, in the short run, they could go from having negative profits to positive. Now, there's positive profits here, even without firm exit, right? But now if there's positive profits, what's going to happen? Firms are then going to start to enter that market. As firms enter that market, it lowers the price until eventually I then get a price that's back down here at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. Here would be like my new quantity, and profits would be equal to 0. Okay. Now, I probably wouldn't throw all this into a single question. I would probably have stopped there thinking about what happens to my profits when firms are able to kind of change their cost curves. So I didn't even put that in the problem, right? We just want to know what happened to the quantity. So the quantity each firm produces will go up. We also said their profits would go up. I drew an extreme example where they go from negative to positive. If you started out as positive, they would just become a larger positive value. But then in the long run, firm entry and exit will always push us back down to that point where profits are equal to 0. Okay. So that should do it for our quiz here. All right. So the next thing that I'll do with the remaining time in class today is scroll. Let's look at these practice problems. And I'll choose, I think, some of the harder ones, okay? So there's one style of question that we didn't really do, but we could be able to solve. So let's look at number 8 for right now, okay? So we're going back a little bit. I think this will be more like what we talked about last class. I think some of the problems at the end we'll have some time for. We'll look more like what we did today. So let's say I just gave you numbers, right? So let's say the current price of a good is 40. Each firm is producing 200 units. I've got total fixed costs of 5,000. I've got total variable costs that are also 5,000. what's happening? Is the firm, should they shut down? Are they staying open with negative profits? Do they have zero profits? Do they have positive profits? Well, I have to think about what I'm doing here. Okay. So what do I need in order to determine all of these things? If I'm thinking about the firm, I need to know what their marginal revenue curve is, right? So what is the firm's marginal revenue? That's simply equal to the price. Now, I know that there's going to be some average total cost, or sorry, I'll start out with marginal. I know there's going to be some marginal cost curve. I don't know what those marginal costs are, but I was told that given whatever those are, the optimal quantity that the firm is producing is 200. Okay. At that quantity, what is my average total and what is my average variable cost? That determines whether or not profits are positive and whether or not I should shut down. We said profits are positive if price is above my average total cost. And then profits are negative if price is below that. And I should shut down. What was our shutdown rule? If the price ever falls below average variable cost. So what are my average variable costs? So once again, we're using stuff we learned earlier in Module 9. It's my total variable costs over quantity. So I'd have what? 5,000 over 200. So I'm going to have what? 25 here. And then what would my average total cost be? Well, what is my total cost divided by quantity? Well, I've got fixed and variable. So my total cost would be 10,000 divided by 200 or 50. So I know that currently at the quantity I'm at, wherever that average total cost curve is, it's somewhere, right? It's at 50. It's above the current price. But I also know at this current quantity and price, my average variable costs are only 25, right? So I kind of write 40 here just to kind of have the comparison. So at this current price, what's going to be true? Firms will have negative profits, right? Price is below average total cost. However, it's above average variable cost, so I should stay open operating with those negative profits. Okay. So here, I know that they would choose to stay open and produce, and they'll have negative economic profits. Okay. Now, let's say I had the exact same setup. The only thing that changes is now that I've got, excuse me, a price of 20. Let me make sure, what did I do with question 10? Yeah. So let's say I had question 9, and I say, okay, what's now going to be true about profits? I would have the same graph here. What's the only thing that's going to change? Well, my price is now 20. That's going to be somewhere down here, right? So if I'm at 200 units, but instead that was going to be true when the price was 20, now my price is below average variable and average total. So what should I do? Shut down. Okay. So if the price is ever below our average variable cost at the current profit maximizing quantity, we know we should just shut down. Now, follow-up question, if I asked you, what are the profits when the price is equal to 20 here? Well, I wouldn't take price minus average total cost. So, we might think generally our profit equation looks like this. But if I plug in 200, I've got a price of what? 20, average total cost of 50. Okay. So this would be what? 30 times 200, I'd be at negative 6,000. Okay. Okay, that's my profits. No, right? I know that when I shut down, this is no longer my profit equation. When I shut down, my profits are simply negative whatever my fixed costs are. What were my fixed costs? 5,000. So if the price falls below average variable, I should shut down. What would my profits be? Negative 5,000. Negative 5,000 is better than staying open, operating, and having losses of 6,000. Okay. Questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So let's say that the price did go up to 60, right? Well, now how would I answer this exact same question? Well, if I've got a price of 60 at that quantity of 200, what's now true at this quantity? Price is above average total. Now I can use this profit equation, right? Because I'm not shutting down. So it's just a matter of plugging in, what's my quantity? 200. What's my price? 60. Average total cost was kind of still the same, was 50. So what? 10 times 200, so $2,000. That would be my profits there. So, really those questions are all pretty similar. You've got to take those total fixed and total variable costs to find your total cost. And then it's really just a matter of comparing your price to the average total and to the average variable. The one kind of thing that wasn't in here that's kind of a tricky one would be if I'm at a price where I should shut down, how do I calculate profits there? It's not using that typical kind of quantity times the difference between price and average total cost. It's simply your profits will be negative whatever your fixed costs are. And that might show up on an exam or a quiz, wink, wink. Okay. All right. So before I just kind of pick and choose any more here, are there any, if anyone had looked at these already, is there any of them that people wanted to see kind of worked through? If not, I'll pick and choose the ones I think. Okay. So I would also throw in for this quiz and for the exam, some questions that aren't on here that I spent some time on today is thinking about what's going to happen in a market when you have a demand increase or if firms are able to decrease their marginal and average total cost curves. So I'd make sure I would review that discussion that we had today because you could see some potential questions from related to those. But you might see something that looks more like this as well. Okay. So here, if I gave you a table and I wanted you to find what the optimal quantity, what profits are at a certain price, will firms enter and exit, choose to shut down, etc. How would you use this table to do that? So I'm actually going to go ahead and show you a more complicated table. And to kind of show you can do this by hand, but I think it's also helpful to see it in a more grand scale. So where is this at? Yeah. So I want this Excel file. Okay. Hoping we'd have time for this. So notice here, I've got this kind of table. I've got profits and then different things written in here. Here I was just giving you total cost and total variable costs. Okay. So if I had total cost and just my total variable cost, how could I fill out like the rest of this chart? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead because I'm going to make some changes to this. Oops. Oh, I'm used to my Mac. There we go. All right. So I'm going to Control C. Going to go over here. Okay. So here I'm setting the price in this box, right? So I'm having it compute my kind of average, my total cost as well as my variable costs. I'm also doing margin revenue, things like that. So what is my total revenue going to be? Right? So I've got this maybe kind of rounded so it looks a little bit different, but really all total revenue is, if I give you a price, you know that the total revenue earned is going to be whatever the quantity you're selling multiplied by the marginal revenue, which simply is the price. So notice here, everything here I've got set. So if I change the price, there's my new marginal revenue, and then my new computed total revenue. Now, if I gave you the total cost, but I didn't tell you the average total, let's say I didn't tell you the marginal cost. Oh, actually, what did I want here? I computed this differently. Hold on. 1, 2, copy. Paste values. There we go. So I'm going to get rid of all this, okay? So if I just gave you the total costs, right? And that's kind of similar to here, we have total cost. I actually gave you total variable cost here. I'll show you why you don't necessarily need that column. You could actually I could just give you this output and you could find my total variable cost as well. So how could I do that? So if I know that my total cost at 0 are $6, well, what must my fixed cost be? Well, if I'm producing nothing, and I have cost of 6, that must be my fixed cost. So what would my total variable cost always be? It's just going to be my total cost minus, what was that fixed cost? 6. So I could do that for every single value. So I could do this by hand. Excel kind of makes this nice because when I copy down the formula, it updates it. So it's always just taking the total cost and subtracting that total fixed cost of 6. In fact, I could get a little bit tricky with this. I could actually select this here, freeze this. Now when I copy this down, I don't even have to put in the value of 6 in case I want to change it later. It keeps using that whatever fixed cost or whatever values in this column or a row. Oh my gosh, whatever values in this cell, because that row is a quantity of 0, so that must be what my fixed cost is. Now from there, how do I find my average total cost? Well, my average total cost is simply going to be my total cost divided by the quantity I'm producing. That's going to be true. I could go ahead and do it manually, right? Take the total cost divided by my quantity. I could do that for every single cell, and that would produce my average total cost column. Now, how do firms make production decisions? Well, they do it based off of marginal costs. So what is my marginal cost? It's going to be a change in my total cost. So whatever the current total cost is, minus my old total cost, divided by, now here I have quantity jumps of 1, so I could just do divide by 1 here. Or if I change this to like jumps of 10, take the new quantity minus my old quantity, that's the change in my quantity. So change in total cost over the change in quantity gives me my marginal cost. I'll then do that for every single value here. How would I find my average variable cost? Well, that's just take my total variable cost, divide it by the quantity I'm producing, and then do that for every single cell here. So notice if I've got my marginal cost and my marginal revenue, initially I'm going to have these areas where marginal revenue is below marginal cost. But we said as long as we are lowering our marginal cost, we have gains from specialization, right? In these first 6 units, I'm lowering my marginal cost. We're always going to continue to produce more. Now, marginal revenue is above my marginal cost for these units. As I produce more, that's still true here, still true here. At that quantity of 9, the marginal cost is now above my marginal revenue, right? So I would have stopped at that quantity of 8. We can kind of think about that's going to be my profit maximizing quantity given this current price. Okay. Now, if I look at that, well, if the price is 250, my average total cost is 298. What's going to be true about profits? Well, I've got a column over here. How do I calculate profits? I could simply do total revenue minus my total cost. I could also do another column where I take what? The quantity, multiply that by the difference between price and my average total. Hopefully, if what I've been telling you is correct, these should all be the same value. Sure enough, they are. And then these all kind of represent negative values. So you'll notice here at this low price, my profits are always negative, no matter what I choose. Where are they the lowest negative value? Well, negative 3.8 is the lowest negative value here. That's why that quantity of 8 was the optimal kind of quantity to produce. Okay. Now, should I shut down? Well, we can look at a couple comparisons. If I shut down, what would my profits be? If I shut down, simply negative $6. If I stay open, I can earn negative 3.8, so it's better to stay open. What also should tell me that? As long as the price is above the lowest part of my average variable cost, which looks like here is this 2.23, as long as the price is above 2.23, I will always be minimizing my losses by staying open. So even if it's like 2.25, notice, oh yeah, if I stay open, my profits are just a little bit lower of a negative value. Okay. So when I'm given problems like this, I can compute my marginal cost using the total cost and the quantity. I can find fixed costs, right, at that quantity of 0. I can find average variable, average total. I could build out this entire, now I won't give you one where you have like 15 quantities. It'll much more like to be something like this where you've got, 5 or 6. But then ultimately we're using everything we talked about. So let's say instead, let's look at this. What's the lowest point of my average total cost curve? Looks like it's at 2.96. So if the price was 3, once again, I have this cell reference, so it'll update all my marginal revenue. So now marginal revenue is above my marginal costs at the 9th unit as well. So now instead of producing 8, the marginal revenue, the last quantity where it's above marginal cost, is now at this quantity of 9. So where are my profits maximized? Oh yeah, I can also just look at where my profits were highest, and that was at a quantity of 9. As soon as that price was above the minimum of my average total cost, what is now true? I could have positive profits. Right? Remember that minimum point of the average total cost was our break-even point. So if I put in something like 2.96, right, it's getting really close to kind of 0 there. We've got some rounding kind of issues going on. But that's kind of the junk. So this isn't quite 2.96. It's like 2.95 something, right? And then I can see it. What if the price starts to get higher and higher? Well, then what's going to be true? Well, where's the last quantity where the price or the marginal revenue is now above marginal cost? It looks like it would now be here at a quantity of 10. So now my optimal quantity would be 10. Sure enough, that's where profits are at their highest. They're positive now, and 19.5. Right? So, you build a table like this and kind of play around with, if I have different prices, should I shut down? Will I be earning negative profits if I stay open and I'm maximizing profits, or will I earn positive profits when I'm choosing that quantity that maximizes profits? And hopefully you can see, like, when prices is going up, so we started at what, 250, we went to 3, then to 5. The optimal quantity the firm was choosing kept going higher and higher. So if I do like a price of 10, well, now profits are highest, what, right here, where the last quantity where price was above our marginal cost would have been the 13th. So as the price goes up, the quantity the firm chooses continues to go higher and higher. As the price goes up, they're more likely to be earning larger and larger positive economic profits. And then we also had the ranges where, let's say I was at like a price of 2. Well, we know that's far below that minimum point of my average variable cost curve. It's also below the minimum point of the average total cost. So I know profits will be negative, but I also know that if the price was 2, every single level of profits, if I stay open, where's the lowest profits? Looks like it's losing 7.8. Is that better or worse than if I just shut down and lost 6? It'd be worse, and that's because the price is below that lowest value of my average variable cost of 2.23. Okay. Any questions for anything there before we keep? Okay, so that should kind of end it for us. I think this is hopefully somewhat of a helpful discussion to have. It's a more complicated example than I would expect you to kind of work through. I would give you maybe something a lot more simple. In fact, quiz question is almost going to look exactly like, different numbers, but when you would have these 3 columns and then be asked to like determine kind of what profits are, should they shut down, etc. And then if we have positive or negative profit, the kind of follow-ups that we had today was, do firms enter or exit? As firms enter or exit, what does that do to kind of your equilibrium price? And we know that in the long run, firm entry and exit should always push your profits down to 0 in the long run. Okay. So that should do it for us today. Any questions over anything before we get out of here? Okay. Before I forget, and if you want to take it right after, I would maybe study a little bit more, but that module 10 quiz is now available, due at the end of the day, Sunday. Okay. I'm gonna stop the recording.